Dawn breaks over the Pacific. The horizon glows faintly beneath a curtain of haze, the kind that blurs distance and hides movement. Japanese coastal gunners stare into that pale line between sea and sky, their binoculars tracing the dark silhouettes of landing craft advancing in neat formation. They have seen this sight before, the slow, methodical approach of invasion. Engines droning, wakes cutting toward the sand, the ocean itself trembling under the weight of war. Orders echo through the tunnels behind the shore batteries. Machine gunners take their positions. Mortar crews check range tables. The defense of the island has been rehearsed 100 times, an unbroken rhythm of confidence, precision, and belief that the sea will hold. The first wave of landing craft moves closer, each bow heavy with Marines. Then, through the mist, something unfamiliar begins to rise. At first, the gunners think they are new boats, low and awkward, barely visible above the swell. But as the sun edges higher, the shapes reveal themselves, angular, armored, unnatural. Tanks where only ships should be. Their turrets emerge like predators breaching the surface. Spray bursts against metal. Exhaust smoke trails behind them as water pours from their sides. The men at the gun pits freeze. Someone shouts, "Impossible! They are floating!" The first shell, fired from shore, misses, not from poor aim, but disbelief. How can armor move through the surf? How can 28 tons of steel glide like a boat? The answer comes too late. The nearest Sherman turns its turret while still half submerged. The gun recoils, sending a column of spray and smoke across the sea. Then another fires, and another, each round finding its mark in the sand bunkers built to stop men, not machines. Through salt spray and chaos, the impossible becomes visible truth. The sea, once trusted as Japan's barrier, now delivers its enemy. From beneath the waves, the tanks climb forward, canvas skirts folding, treads biting into sand. That morning, the soldiers of the Empire saw something no doctrine had prepared them for, an army that had taught its tanks to swim. But what they didn't yet know was that this miracle of motion had been born not from madness, but from 2 years of stubborn faith and quiet engineering. 2 years before that morning in the Pacific, the idea would have sounded absurd, a tank that could swim. Even among Allied engineers, the notion drew quiet laughter. Armor was meant for land, not water. Steel belonged on dry ground, where engines could breathe and treads could grip. To imagine it afloat was to challenge the laws of both physics and common sense. But war has always been the forge of impossibility. In 1941, a Hungarian-born British engineer named Nicholas Straussler proposed what few dared to imagine. His design was audacious in its simplicity. A lightweight frame of metal, supports wrapped in waterproof fabric, rising around the tank like a canvas wall. Inflated with air, it would give buoyancy to 30 tons of armored steel. Behind it, twin propellers would push the machine through water, driven by the same engine that moved it on land. He called it the duplex drive. 2 forms of motion bound by one purpose. To most military minds, it was folly. Commanders looked at the blueprints and saw a coffin. British tank crews joked that the DD stood for death deferred, yet a few men saw promise in the design, not perfection, but potential. When the first prototypes rolled into Scottish locks under grey skies, the onlookers expected disaster. The canvas screens trembled, the propellers sputtered, but the tank moved. Slowly, awkwardly, but forward, afloat. The test reports were cautious, the results fragile, but something extraordinary had happened. Steel had learned to swim, and where the British saw an experiment, the Americans saw a revolution. A tank that could lead amphibious landings meant an entirely new kind of warfare. Beaches no longer defended by distance, armor no longer trapped by tides. The risk was colossal, but so was the prize. The swimming Sherman, as soldiers called it, remained hidden from the public, its secret guarded by silence and disbelief. It was a weapon that should not have existed, and yet did, but no secret stays buried forever. Somewhere across the ocean, another generation of engineers was already asking the next question. If it could float in a loch, could it survive the sea? The men who would crew the new amphibious Shermans met their machines not on battlefields, but on lonely training beaches. There, under the cold wind and watchful eyes of engineers, they were asked to do the unthinkable, to trust fabric and air to keep 30 tons of metal alive. The canvas screen, barely thicker than a raincoat, surrounded the tank like a fragile cocoon. To those inside, it felt like faith stitched into cloth. Each trial began the same way. Engines roared, propellers churned, and the tank rolled down a ramp into the waiting surf. Some floated, wobbling, unsure, but afloat. Others did not. One small leak, one mistake, and the sea took everything. Crews trapped inside vanished without a trace. Men entombed in steel that had promised them buoyancy. The survivors climbed ashore in silence, staring at the waves that had claimed their comrades. They called it training, but it felt like sacrifice. Yet for every failure, there came progress. The tanks that survived their baptism by water inspired awe. "A miracle," one crewman said, "a miracle built with bolts and canvas." Every lesson written in salt and fear made the next launch more certain. Gradually, the impossible became procedure. Faith became skill. By 1944, these machines were no longer curiosities, they were strategy. On the eve of D-Day, hundreds would cross the English Channel, their canvas skirts trembling against the waves. And months later, across the world, others would ride Pacific surf toward black volcanic beaches. Wherever they went, disbelief followed, until the first round was fired from the sea. In Tokyo, military planners still viewed tanks and oceans as eternal opposites, one ruled by gravity, the other by depth. But on distant training sands, that belief was already dissolving. The engineers had proved that the two could coexist, and soon they would conspire. Because before Japan's soldiers ever saw these strange floating Shermans, they had already lost the argument. They just didn't know it yet. By 1943, Japan had built its empire on the promise of geography. The Pacific, vast, blue, and unending, was its shield. Every island, every reef, every jagged coastline was viewed not as a vulnerability, but as a fortress. Coral barriers would wreck enemy ships before they reached the beach. Tides and trenches would swallow the rest. Nature, disciplined and obedient, would do what armies could not: repel invasion by design. Japanese engineers transformed the shoreline into an art form of defense. On volcanic ridges and palm-lined coasts, they carved bunkers into stone. Machine gun nests peered from cliffs. Gun casemates pointed toward narrow strips of sand, each calibrated to catch an enemy at his most fragile, halfway between sea and soil. From the jungles of New Guinea to the black sands of Iwo Jima, the empire believed its coastlines were unbreachable. They called it the perimeter of destiny. The ocean was more than a boundary, it was a weapon. Tanks could not swim. Artillery could not float, and every soldier that stepped off a landing craft had to face the merciless open. Waves slowed movement, salt blinded eyes. A single hit could scatter an entire formation. To Japanese tacticians, the sea was an ally that never slept. Even Allied intelligence shared that conviction. American and British planners accepted that armored vehicles could not land directly under fire. Tanks, it was believed, would come only after the beach was taken, ferried ashore once the water was secure. No one imagined that steel could roll straight from the surf and open fire. To suggest otherwise was to invite ridicule. Japanese officers took comfort in that certainty. "Let them swim," one joked during a strategy meeting, his laughter echoing across a room lined with maps and red markers. To them, the sea was final. It was absolute. In their eyes, no general, no engineer, no nation could ever teach machines to master it. But history is written by those who defy the obvious, and far from Tokyo, in the factories of Detroit and the testing grounds of Scotland, someone was already proving the joke would not age well, because the day was coming when the ocean, Japan's greatest ally, would betray it completely. The British had proved the concept in quiet waters, lakes and lochs where the wind was gentle and the waves obedient. But the Pacific was no loch. It was a living thing, violent and unpredictable. American generals knew it well. They had seen entire landing craft flipped by surf, tanks swallowed whole by reefs. When they first heard of the swimming Sherman, they did not see innovation. They saw disaster waiting to happen. On paper, the design looked sound. In theory, the flotation screens would keep the tank steady. The propellers would drive it like a boat. But theory doesn't account for breaking waves or coral shelves. Engineers in Hawaii built test ranges along the coast, launching prototypes into real surf. The results were sobering. One tank would crest a wave and crawl forward. The next would capsize, vanishing beneath white foam. Crews barely escaped through hatches jammed by water pressure. The Pacific, it seemed, rejected the idea. Still, not everyone gave up. To the men who believed in the project, every failure was a lesson written in salt. Stronger screens were fitted, pumps upgraded, balance recalculated. The solution was not found in genius, but in persistence, in the stubborn conviction that if the human spirit could cross oceans, so could its machines. Slowly, the D.D. Shermans began to endure where their predecessors had drowned, but skepticism lingered. To the old guard, tanks belonged to dry ground and solid footing. They distrusted the concept not because it was flawed, but because it redefined what a tank was. Amphibious armor blurred the boundaries between land and sea, soldier and sailor. It was heresy to convention, and in war, heresy often leads to victory. One Marine officer, watching a successful test, summed up the mood in a single line. "If men can land," he said, "so can their armor." It was not a boast, it was a decision. The Pacific would not dictate the terms of invasion. America would. And so, even as waves broke tanks apart and engineers worked through the night, the plan advanced. The final island battles were coming, and this time, the sea would no longer stand alone. Far across the ocean, in the secret heart of Detroit's factories, machines were already being born for that purpose. Tanks that would learn to float before they learned to fight. While soldiers trained under sun and surf, a quieter war was being fought in Detroit. A war of blueprints, bolts, and belief. The automobile capital of the world, once dedicated to the rhythms of peacetime industry, had become the beating heart of armored innovation. Behind sealed factory doors, the familiar outlines of Sherman tanks began to change. They were no longer built merely to roll across continents. Now they were being prepared to cross the sea. At the Ford and Chrysler plants, rows of half-finished hulls gleamed under the arc of welding sparks. Steel seams were tightened, joints waterproofed, and engines modified to drive twin propellers mounted at the rear. When the last bolt was set, each tank was tested in vast indoor pools, their treads idle, their propellers spinning through still water. It was a strange sight, machines of war pretending to be ships. The engineers called them duplex drive tanks, but the soldiers found their own nickname. Donald Ducks. It was humor, thinly disguising awe. In total, 693 Shermans were converted. Each one carried the same paradox: the weight of a battleship and the buoyancy of a lifeboat. Mechanics painted identification numbers on their new flotation screens, while crews drilled relentlessly on the beaches of Florida and California. They practiced folding the canvas up, sealing it tight, then lowering it again under simulated fire. Every action was timed to seconds. One mistake could turn the tank into a tomb. The first moments after launch were always the hardest. Steel groaned, water hissed, and the canvas walls shuddered before settling into calm. When they floated, the men inside could hardly believe it. To outside observers, the sight remained surreal. Heavy tanks bobbing like ungainly boats, propellers churning wake across shallow surf. It looked absurd, like a mechanical joke told against common sense. But history has never favored the skeptics. The factories of Detroit were not making curiosities. They were shaping inevitability. And while Japanese intelligence monitored the Pacific with confidence, counting ships, not machines that could replace them, an invisible fleet was quietly being born. Its hulls gleamed not under moonlight, but under the fluorescent hum of factory ceilings. The world would not understand what those factories had created until the moment the ocean itself began to move. June 6, 1944. The grey dawn over the English Channel hides 1,000 engines murmuring beneath the surf. Among them, 50-ton machines rock gently on the waves. Shermans draped in canvas, their propellers pushing them toward France. They are the first amphibious tanks ever used in battle. The soldiers aboard the landing craft watch in silence as the DDs slip into the water one by one, vanishing into the mist like strange mechanical creatures returning to their element. The plan is bold. The swimming tanks will reach the beaches before the infantry, breaking the German defenses before the landing craft arrive. But nature, as always, has a vote. Off Omaha Beach, the wind rises, and the waves swell to 6 feet. Salt water seeps into seams not meant to hold it. One tank founders within minutes, then another. The crews fight to stay afloat, their engines roaring beneath rising foam. For many, the sea that was meant to carry them becomes their grave. 27 tanks go down before ever firing a shot. Men who had trusted fabric and faith now struggle in darkness beneath their own machines. But the disaster is not universal. Farther east, at Sword and Juno beaches, the sea is calm, almost eerily so. There the DD Shermans glide forward exactly as planned, their canvas walls shimmering like sails. When their tracks touch sand, the screens fold down and the guns open fire. German defenders, expecting helpless men in boats, instead meet tanks emerging from the waves. Within minutes, beach obstacles are crushed, pillboxes shattered, and landing troops surge forward behind armor. At those beaches, the DDs prove decisive. Their arrival shortens the bloodshed of the first hours, a small miracle bought by faith in an impossible idea. The contrast between success and failure becomes the lesson. The machines had worked, the ocean had not. The difference lay not in design, but in judgment. The timing of the launch, the distance from shore, the rhythm of tide and wind. In the Pacific, where waves were taller and reefs sharper, those lessons would decide everything. After Normandy, engineers gather the data and begin refining the process. Stronger screens, better pumps, tighter seals. But beyond the metal, a deeper understanding takes shape. The amphibious tank is not just a weapon. It is a promise between man and machine, a trust that one will not fail the other when the sea turns violent. Pacific planners study the reports with grim focus. They know their next landings, Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, will make Normandy's waters look gentle, but they also know something else. The idea has already proven itself. It is no longer theory, it is doctrine. The sea, once a wall, has become a bridge. And so, as the final pages of Europe's invasion are written in the sands of France, the blueprints for the Pacific's future quietly change. The next time tanks meet the surf, they will face higher waves, stronger resistance, and they will not fail. In the aftermath of Normandy, the engineers of war turned their gaze toward the Pacific. The calm waters of the Channel had tested courage. The violent surf of the Pacific would test invention itself. In the naval yards of Hawaii, a new generation of duplex-drive Shermans lined the docks, familiar in shape but utterly transformed in spirit. They were not just tanks now, they were experiments in survival. The ocean here was not forgiving. Its salt corroded metal, its heat warped rubber, and its waves broke with the force of hammers. The tanks that had crossed Europe's mild seas would not last a minute here. So the engineers began again. They reinforced the canvas flotation screens with steel ribs, replaced fragile seams with rubberized seals, and doubled the bilge pumps that fought to keep water from seeping in. Propellers were strengthened, engine intakes reworked, and hulls treated against corrosion. Every flaw found in France was corrected in Hawaii, one lesson at a time. Each adjustment brought new trials. Crews launched their DDs into the surf again and again, learning to read the rhythm of the tide like sailors rather than soldiers. Launch too soon, and a tank would founder before it could steer. Launch too late, and the landing craft would jam the beachhead. Precision replaced luck. The ocean became a clock, and every man aboard learned its tempo. The DD Sherman was no longer a machine that defied nature. It was one that learned to move with it. On the practice beaches of Oahu, the sound of diesel engines mingled with the crash of waves. Pilots of landing craft shouted signals as tank commanders stood waist-deep in surf, adjusting the angle of propellers or the tension of the flotation screen. It was a choreography of courage, a ballet of metal and will. By the end of each day, canvas dripped with seawater, and salt crusted over armor plates like frost. Yet each night, the tests grew longer, the failures fewer. The impossible was becoming routine. Then came the real test, the invasions of Saipan and Guam. Under fire for the first time since Normandy, the new DD Shermans entered the surf. Shells exploded around them. Coral reefs lurked unseen beneath the waves. Some faltered, some sank, but most reached the shore. The survivors rolled onto sand, screens collapsing, guns turning inland. Japanese defenders, expecting the same slow, segmented landings of earlier battles, instead faced tanks that seemed to emerge from the sea itself. For the Marines following behind, it was a vision of reassurance. Steel already waiting where men feared to tread. Reports filtered back to Allied command within days. The numbers were staggering. Nearly every tank launched at Saipan, and Guam had reached its target. The failures that haunted Omaha Beach were not repeated. The system, once doubted and dismissed, had become dependable. What began as a fragile idea wrapped in canvas was now an instrument of confidence. Engineers had turned improvisation into doctrine. In the Pacific, the phrase amphibious armor no longer drew laughter. It drew respect. From Honolulu to Washington, officers realized that the line between sea and land had been erased. The tank was no longer earthbound. It was an amphibian, born of necessity, baptized by fire, and perfected by persistence. The amphibious age had arrived, and on the horizon, an island called Iwo Jima waited, the final proving ground for machines that had learned to float before they learned to fight. February 1945. In the center of the Pacific, an island of black volcanic sand waits beneath a haze of sulfur and smoke. Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of rock and fire, stands as Japan's final shield before the homeland. For weeks, American bombers have pounded it into ruin, yet beneath the ash, 20,000 Japanese soldiers remain, hidden in tunnels, bunkers, and caves. They do not defend the beaches. They have learned that lesson. They will wait underground, and when the enemy comes ashore, they will strike. Offshore, the horizon bristles with ships, more than 800 vessels forming the greatest armada ever assembled in the Pacific. Marines crowd the decks of landing craft, staring toward the island where nothing seems alive. They have been told the battle will be short. Few believe it. The sea is restless, its grey waves rolling under a low, cold sky. Somewhere beneath those waves, another secret waits. Machines unlike any the Japanese have ever imagined. Within the holds of the landing ships rest dozens of DD Shermans, amphibious tanks prepared for their ultimate test. Their engines are sealed, their canvas screens rolled tight, their crews silent. The Japanese, watching from their concealed periscopes, see only boats. They have no idea that steel and fire will soon emerge from the same surf they consider impassable. As dawn breaks, the order is given. Marines climb into their landing craft, while behind them, the tanks awaken. Propellers churn the grey water into froth. Engines growl low, steady, almost calm, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the roar of the sea. One by one, the DD Shermans roll down their ramps and slide into the surf. For a moment they vanish, swallowed by the waves. Then, miraculously, they rise again, the screens unfolding like sails. Against the smoke and horizon, they look like shadows moving with purpose. Some do not make it. A swell capsizes one before it can stabilize, another drifts too far and founders. For the men inside, there is no time for panic, only the sound of rushing water and the closing dark. But most endure. Their propellers push forward, slow and stubborn, until the surf begins to break beneath their treads. Ahead lies the beach, a slope of black sand, already alive with artillery. When the tanks reach shallows, the crews lower the screens. The canvas collapses like wings folding at rest. Guns traverse, turrets lock on target. The first shells strike the bunkers hidden in the cliffs. Marines cheer from their landing craft, seeing the impossible. Tanks firing from the sea itself. Gunfire ripples across the water, as if the ocean has come alive with purpose. On Iwo Jima, Japanese officers shout in confusion. The enemy has not waited for the tide. The tide itself has carried them. The doctrine of island defense, once their greatest pride, dissolves in a single morning. For every wave that breaks on that black beach, another tank crawls from it, dripping salt and smoke. By noon, the invasion is fully underway. The DD Shermans lead the first waves inland, their treads grinding through ash and cratered rock. Behind them, Marines follow, sheltered by the machines that refuse to sink. For years, Japan had trusted the sea as its moat, its guardian. But now that moat has turned traitor. The ocean no longer defends the empire. It delivers its undoing. And as the sun rises over the smoke of Iwo Jima, one truth becomes clear. The sea has learned to carry steel. And soon, the land itself will learn to burn. The first shells fall before the first wave reaches the shore. From the cliffs of Iwo Jima, Japanese guns roar down upon the sea, a barrage so dense it seems to boil the water. For hours they have waited in silence, watching the horizon shimmer with American ships. Now the ocean itself seems to erupt. Landing craft splinter. Smoke thickens over the surf, and then, through that chaos, something impossible begins to rise. Out of the mist, the shapes appear, broad, low, and moving. They are not boats, they are not barges, they are tanks. The gunners on the island stare in disbelief as grey silhouettes glide through the waves, canvas screens glinting wet under the morning sun. The first DD Shermans strike sand within minutes of the landing craft. Their screens collapse like discarded sails, revealing turrets already turning toward the shore. Machine guns chatter, cannons thunder. It is as if the sea itself has come alive, and it is angry. Marines cheer from their Higgins boats, disbelief mixing with relief. For months they had trained to storm beaches under fire, expecting to meet the enemy with rifles alone. But now, before their boots touch the sand, steel has beaten them there. Tanks roll forward in columns, tracks grinding through black volcanic ash. They do not wait for orders. They are the orders, the moving symbols of a new kind of warfare. On Mount Suribachi, Japanese spotters frantically relay what they see. Tanks in the water, one officer reports. The command bunker responds with silence, convinced it is a mistake. Tanks cannot swim. Everyone knows that. Yet below, the truth contradicts every assumption. The Shermans crawl through craters and broken coral, their flamethrowers belching streams of fire into the mouths of bunkers that had survived weeks of bombardment. Concrete melts, sand fuses into glass. The defenders, waiting for the tide to save them, find themselves drowning in it instead. By mid-morning, the first line of Japanese defenses is gone, erased not by numbers, but by disbelief. The old doctrine of impregnable beaches, of coastal supremacy, dies in a single day. The tanks move in coordinated rhythm with the waves behind them, each landing craft bringing another section of armor to life. When the smoke clears briefly, the view from the air tells the story better than any report. Dozens of Shermans scattered across the beachhead like stepping stones, forming a moving bridge between sea and land. For the Japanese commanders, the shock is total. They had built their defenses around nature, around the assumption that the ocean would remain an ally. They had counted on reefs, surf, and sand to halt machines where men might still crawl. But now, as their trenches fill with smoke and flame, they face an enemy that has rewritten the laws of geography. The Pacific, once their moat, has become a highway. Among the Marines, awe replaces fear. They move behind the tanks, shielded from fire, advancing farther in a single morning than planners had dared to hope for. The Shermans burn fuel and courage in equal measure, each one a floating miracle-turned weapon. Even those that falter, sunk, stalled, or shattered by direct hits, serve a purpose. They draw fire, they create cover, they prove what can be done. By noon, the shore of Iwo Jima no longer belongs to Japan. It belongs to the machines that refused to sink and to the men who believed in them. Flames roll through the caves carved into the cliffs. The air smells of salt, smoke, and steel, the trinity of modern war. And above it all, the sea continues its steady rhythm. Indifferent, eternal, carrying the next wave of tanks closer to the land. The myth of the ocean fortress ends here, not with surrender, but with realization. The age of stone walls and natural barriers is over. The Pacific's tide has turned to iron and fire, and it will not recede. But deeper in the island, far below the burning bunkers, tunnels still stretch for miles, and in that darkness, Japan's defenders prepare for a new kind of war, one that the tide cannot wash away. April 1945. The war in the Pacific has one more island to claim. Okinawa. It is the gateway to Japan itself, the last great fortress before the mainland. For 3 years, Japan's defenders have watched the sea bring death to their empire. Now, as American ships darken the horizon once again, they wait among the ridges and rice paddies, believing they have learned from Iwo Jima. The old traps are gone, the beaches abandoned. They will fight inland, where the jungle and mud will do what fortifications no longer can. But the sea has changed. and so have the machines that come from it. At dawn, the water off Okinawa shivers with movement. Hundreds of landing craft advance in perfect formation, carrying men, armor, and a weapon the defenders still do not believe can exist: the duplex drive. Sherman, its canvas screen rising like a pale curtain, slides off its ramp into the surf. Behind it, another follows, and another. The propellers churn the turquoise shallows into white foam. From the shore, they appear to be small boats. Only when the first ones reach the edge of the reefs does their disguise collapse, revealing the familiar silhouette of a tank. The Japanese spotters sound the alarm, but it is too late. The new American doctrine moves faster than their understanding. The beaches fall in minutes. Tanks climb the coral shelves, their treads slick with seaweed and sand. Marines follow behind them, their rifles held high above the waves. It is not a landing, it is an emergence. The sea itself seems to give birth to an army. Inland, the terrain turns from sand to swamp. Okinawa's fields are flooded from spring rains, its paddies deep enough to drown a man. Here, the defenders believe the tanks will stop, just as they always have. But the DD Shermans do not stop. They move slowly, deliberately, propellers still turning beneath the surface as if they are half creature, half machine. The water ripples around their hulls. When the ground softens, they do not sink. They float forward, bridging streams and craters, climbing out where no road exists. For the infantry, watching from behind, it feels like witnessing evolution in motion. Tanks were once chained to the earth. Now they glide where men wade. In every flooded valley, in every ditch meant to trap them, the Americans advance. To the Japanese soldiers who see them appear through the mist and the mangroves, it feels supernatural. There is no longer such a thing as safe ground. The old tactics fail, one by one. Mines planted in shallow mud wash away. Trench lines flood, bunkers crumble. The sound of the ocean, once comfort, once protection, now means attack. The defenders retreat from the coast into the hills, but even there the pattern repeats. Tanks move with the Marines through terrain once thought unpassable. The Empire's last advantage, its islands, no longer belongs to it. By the end of the first week, the DD Shermans have become more than a weapon. They are a message. Every new island assault begins not with infantry alone, but with armor leading the way from the water. What began as an experiment has become doctrine, and doctrine has become destiny. American engineers, once dismissed as dreamers, now shape the rhythm of every battle. Their calculations, their blueprints, their canvas screens, all have rewritten how empires fall. When night descends on Okinawa, the fields glisten under rain and artillery fire. The sea continues to roll against the shore, quiet and relentless. For the men who fight here, there is a sense that the Pacific itself has changed allegiance. It no longer defends Japan. It carries its conquerors. The sea, once Japan's moat, has become its invader. And in that transformation lies the truth of modern war. That invention, not geography, decides the fate of nations. When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima, the beach was a graveyard of metal. Wrecked landing craft lay twisted against the volcanic sand. Sherman tanks, half buried and blackened by fire, pointed their guns toward the cliffs, as if still guarding the men they had carried. Between them, thin strips of fabric flapped in the wind, the remnants of the flotation screens that had once kept them alive. They looked like torn sails after a storm, relics of a voyage from sea to land. Each wreck told its own story. Some had made it to the beach, fired their last rounds, and burned where they stood. Others never reached shore, swallowed by the surf, pulled down by the same waves they had dared to cross. But even in ruin, they spoke of courage. not the human kind that shouts, but the mechanical kind that endures. The canvas still smelled of salt and oil. Its seams were frayed, but its purpose had been fulfilled. For every tank that sank beneath the Pacific, 3 more had reached land. Each one had carried a crew of 5, men who had trusted cloth and air to keep 30 tons of steel afloat. Many never forgot that first moment, when the ramp fell and water rose against the hull. They had called it madness. They had called it suicide. Yet they went anyway. Those who survived called the D.D. Shermans the bravest machines. Not because they were flawless, but because they had dared something no one thought possible. On the beaches of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, engineers and soldiers alike began to see the pattern. War was no longer won by the strongest weapon, but by the most adaptable idea. The D.D. Sherman had not been designed for beauty or speed. It had been designed to bridge the impossible, to erase the boundary between land and sea. And it had done exactly that. The experiment was over. The revolution had succeeded. Even the Japanese survivors, taken prisoner after the battle, came to see it. One officer reportedly asked to walk among the wrecks. He said nothing as he examined the torn fabric and rusting steel. Finally, he whispered, "So this is how you reached us." To him, the machines were not just weapons. They were symbols of imagination made real, of belief made dangerous. The empire that had trusted in the ocean's protection now understood how fragile faith in geography could be. Weeks later, when the famous photograph of the flag raising atop Mount Suribachi circled the world, few noticed that the tanks were visible below. Tiny, dark shapes scattered across the shore. But they were there, part of the same moment, part of the same story. The Marines had planted a flag on rock, but the D.D. Shermans had carried it across the water. One symbol of victory depended on another, a reminder that every triumph rests on the quiet work of those who make the impossible routine. As the tide returned, the waves crept up the beach and washed over the fallen machines. The ocean that had carried them to war now took them back, grain by grain. Their canvas screens fluttered once more, then fell still. Around them, men rebuilt, buried, remembered. Some spoke of the courage it took to fight, others of the courage it took to believe in fabric and physics when logic said it would fail. The sea had once been a wall. The D.D. Sherman turned it into a doorway, and when that doorway closed, history would remember what passed through it. Because on those beaches, under the rising flag and the falling surf, invention had written victory, and the future of warfare had taken its first breath. When the guns fell silent and the Pacific stopped burning, the sea returned to what it had always been, vast, indifferent, and eternal. The waves that once carried fleets and fire now carried silence, but beneath that calm surface lay the memory of machines that had once dared to float where no armor should have survived. After Japan's surrender, Allied engineers began to tally the record of the strange experiment that had helped win the war. 1,200 duplex drive tanks had been built and deployed across 2 oceans. Nearly half had fought successfully, some storming European beaches, others crawling from Pacific surf under artillery fire. By military standards, it was an imperfect weapon, but by human ones, it was something far greater. Proof that imagination could breach even the laws of nature. In the reports compiled after the war, numbers filled the margins: tonnage, speed, failure rates. Yet the engineers reading them found themselves pausing not at the statistics, but at the testimonies of the men who had driven them. These were not the words of soldiers speaking of glory. They were accounts of fear, of sitting in a steel box as water rose past the vision slit, of hearing the fabric screen creak under pressure, of praying that canvas and courage would hold long enough to reach the sand. Many later said that the moment between sea and shore was the longest minute of their lives. They remembered the surf more vividly than the bullets. The enemy was faceless, but the ocean had a voice. It roared in the propellers, hissed through the seams, whispered against the armor like a warning. And yet they trusted it, because their belief was not in luck, but in design. They had been told the math would save them, that buoyancy and balance could turn iron into something that floated. Against all reason, it had. On the other side of the world, in post-war Japan, military scholars began their own study of the weapon they had never truly seen in time. Engineers who once built defenses against tanks now examined blueprints of machines that swam. What astonished them was not complexity, but simplicity. The system was so straightforward, so achievable, that they wondered how they had never imagined it themselves. One Japanese report summarized the revelation with quiet awe. They built boats from belief. In those few words lay the essence of the lesson. The D.D. Sherman was not born from superiority of material, or even of wealth. It was born from faith in process, from a civilization that trusted iteration, testing, and failure more than pride or prophecy. Its canvas screens were fragile, its structure ungainly, yet its logic was flawless. It worked not because it was perfect, but because it was possible, and because someone refused to stop at doubt. By 1946, many of the surviving tanks had been scrapped or sunk as artificial reefs. Their steel shells became homes for coral and fish. The ocean that once tried to destroy them now preserved them in silence. Divers who found them decades later spoke of the eerie peace in those resting places, the way light filtered through torn fabric, how barnacles clung to the same seams that once kept men alive. Even in ruin, they looked purposeful, as if waiting for the next tide. History would remember larger machines, faster ships, and deadlier bombs. But the duplex drive tank endured in memory because it had no right to exist. And yet it did. It was a contradiction made real, a weapon of war built on the fragile materials of trust, ingenuity, and courage. In every wrecked hull, there lay a quiet reminder that imagination, once set afloat, cannot be sunk. And as nations rebuilt from the ashes, that imagination would become their new battlefield. The sea had carried destruction once. Now it would carry ideas. When the world rebuilt itself after 1945, the oceans did not rest. They became laboratories, places where the lessons of the war were studied, refined, and reborn in steel. The duplex drive Sherman, that fragile contraption of canvas and courage, had proven one truth beyond doubt. The future of war would belong to those who could master movement between worlds, land and sea, man and machine. In the shipyards of California, New Jersey, and Okinawa, new shapes began to appear on blueprints. Engineers studied the DD's awkward grace and saw not absurdity, but potential. Its failures became formulas, its oddities, inspiration. From its design came a family of successors, the LVTs and Amtraks that would define the amphibious age. They were stronger, faster, and far less afraid of the surf. Yet every bolt and gasket still whispered of the old Donald Duck. By the early years of the Cold War, entire doctrines had evolved from that one experiment. The American military's vision of combined arms, sea, air, and armor working in perfect rhythm, became the new gospel of modern warfare. Aircraft carriers no longer sailed alone. They carried within them a floating ecosystem of mobility. Marines could strike from ocean to shore with machines that swam, flew, and rolled as one. The D.D. Sherman had begun as a weapon of desperation. It ended as a philosophy of design. In the Pentagon's strategic maps, the world itself began to look different. The old boundaries of coastlines blurred. Where generals once saw obstacles, reefs, tides, deltas, planners now saw corridors of opportunity. The sea was no longer a wall to defend or breach. It had become a highway, a road paved not with asphalt, but with innovation. The nations that studied this transformation understood what Japan had learned too late. Power was no longer measured by territory, but by reach. Japan's fall had not been written in its defeat on land, but in the collapse of its faith in isolation. Its empire had trusted the ocean to be a moat, but America had turned that moat into a runway. Mobility without boundaries had sealed the war's outcome long before the bombs fell, and from that victory came a kind of moral irony. The same ocean that once divided enemies would in the years ahead unite their technologies. Post-war Japan would rebuild using the very principles that had defeated it: modular design, process over perfection, motion as discipline. Its engineers, once trapped by tradition, would become the new masters of mass innovation. The tide of knowledge had turned both ways. Even today, when modern amphibious vehicles slide into the surf, sleek, digital, unrecognizable, their lineage can be traced back to that trembling moment in 1944 when a Sherman tank first floated and fired from the sea. It is the quiet echo of an idea that refused to drown. The D.D. Sherman had no monument, no statue in bronze, but its legacy endures in every engine that carries mankind beyond its limits, because in the end, its greatest gift was not victory, it was vision. It showed that even the most impossible machine could find purpose when imagination replaced certainty. The ocean was once a barrier. Now it is a road, and that road was paved by a machine that dared to float. Before Iwo Jima, Japanese intelligence officers reviewed intercepted Allied reports of a new kind of tank. Swimming armor, the documents claimed, vehicles that could move from ship to shore without landing craft. Around the briefing tables in Tokyo, the phrase was met with laughter. To the imperial staff, it sounded like a child's fantasy, the fever dream of engineers who had never faced the Pacific's rage. The ocean was sacred, they believed, a boundary ordained by nature itself. To imagine steel crossing it by buoyancy was to misunderstand both the sea and the empire that ruled it. For centuries, Japan had trusted water as its greatest fortress. Its islands, encircled by reefs and surf, had repelled invasions long before machines existed. Even in modern war, the ocean was still an ally, deep, unpredictable, merciless. Generals told their men that no tank, no engine, no invention could conquer the tide. The empire's security lay not only in soldiers and guns, but in geography and faith. The Pacific would protect them, as it always had. But in February 1945, the sea betrayed them. Off the beaches of Iwo Jima, the waves parted, not for ships or landing barges, but for something they had never imagined. Out of the surf rose the shapes of Sherman tanks, dripping with salt water, their canvas screens folding away like wings. They were still firing as they rolled onto the black sand. What had seemed absurd in theory now advanced in perfect formation, a tide of armor born from the ocean itself. For the first time, Japan watched its oldest protector turn invader. In the chaos of that morning, disbelief turned to silence. Reports from frontline observers described officers shouting over the guns, demanding answers. How could tanks come from the water? There was no strategy for this, no defense prepared. The myth of the ocean fortress, so deeply rooted in Japanese doctrine, collapsed in an instant of salt and smoke. What they faced was not a miracle, but the culmination of faith of another kind, faith in imagination, engineering, and the relentless refusal to accept limits. The D.D. Sherman was never plaguant. It was a machine built on compromise, canvas stretched over metal, physics balanced by faith. Its crews knew its flaws better than anyone. The leaks, the currents, the way a single tear in the screen could turn a tank into a tomb. But what mattered was that it worked. It embodied a principle that would outlive it, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it through invention. Every wave crossed by a DD tank was a statement. The impossible is only a problem waiting for design. In the aftermath of the war, Japan's engineers studied the captured wrecks in awe. They found no secret technology, no hidden engine of sorcery, only logic, patience, and the discipline of testing what others mocked. The tanks had not conquered the sea by force. They had learned to cooperate with it. That was the deeper revelation. The water had not been defied. It had been understood. From that understanding came a new kind of power, one not defined by territory, but by adaptability. The United States had mastered not only the machinery of war, but the mindset that made machinery evolve. The DD Sherman, crude yet visionary, was proof that belief in motion could outpace belief in walls. In the end, the Japanese were right about one thing. You could not build armor to swim. Not until someone did. The Pacific once laughed at the idea of tanks that floated. Then it carried them to victory. They laughed at the floating tanks once. They never laughed again.